Good afternoon. I'm here today to share with you a few stories that have shaped my outlook on a few of the issues that we all care deeply about. Nearly 20 years ago, I was fresh out of college and ready to take on the world, full of optimism, and I had gotten my dream job. I was working for Oxfam. I had the opportunity to go to a community in rural southern Vietnam, to a community that was in crisis. Rice farmers in that community who had been cultivating the land for thousands of years were switching to shrimp in an attempt to lift themselves out of the grinding poverty they had faced for so long. But the problem was they didn't have the experience of how to do this successfully, and tragedies were playing out every single day as they were becoming worse and worse off. And my responsibility was to look for the solution to this issue, to try to find a way to identify what it is that government should be doing, that NGOs should be doing. And as for business, well, at that time I thought, surely business must be part of the problem. But as I looked around this community, the situation was bleak. It was a very remote area in southern Vietnam, deep into the Mekong Delta, and government was few and far between. NGOs had very little presence. And much to my surprise, business was actually everywhere. Going door to door, from household to household, young men in bright yellow polo shirts were training farmers on how to raise shrimp and how to raise shrimp successfully. They were from a Thai seafood company named CP. And their interest in being there was to buy the shrimp and to create a new market. And while this wasn't a silver bullet to the issues those farmers were facing, I do remember seeing the look of hope on the faces of those farmers as the weeks and months went by and as they started to make a better living for their families. You know, I was so inspired by this, the potential at the intersection of business interests and the interests of the poor, of smallholder farmers, that I actually decided to leave the nonprofit industry and go into business. And since that time, I've had the privilege of working for two of the world's leading global food and beverage companies. And in fact, just a few years later, I found myself working for Coca-Cola at the headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. And I was in a conference room talking with the juice team, which was running the world's largest juice business. The business problem they were facing was they wanted to grow in East Africa, but there was no local fruit juice supply chain. And as a result, they were having to import at great cost tropical fruit juice purees. And as we were brainstorming about how to overcome this problem, someone mentioned offhand, well, you know, someone a while back from the Gates Foundation reached out about building a local fruit juice supply chain. And my eyes lit up at that moment, thinking back to my experience in Vietnam, and I said, we need to return that call. And we did, and a few years later, we were able, with the Gates Foundation and others, to build Project Nurture. It was a project that reached 50,000 farmers in Kenya and Tanzania, small farmers who were living in poverty and who previously didn't have any way to monetize the tropical fruits that grew on their land. And for the first time, we were able to provide them with training, with access to financing, and with a link into a new, enhanced fruit juice supply chain with new infrastructure that we invested in that part of the world. And I remember in particular, as the average incomes doubled for these farmers, the faces of the women in those communities who had a new opportunity to put money in their pockets. I was hooked. I saw what was really possible. And in fact, there is a lot of good news when you look at the story of the transformation of communities in poverty over the past 20, 30 years. Hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty, which is fantastic news. But today, nearly 500 million smallholder farmers are still living in poverty. They're living on under $2 a day. They're vulnerable to human rights abuses. They do not have a safety net. They do not have savings. And they're at the mercy of weather and pests. And women and children are hit the hardest. And among those nearly 500 million, some estimate that 100 million of them may be linked to global supply chains. And it's that link and the scale of that link that inspires me in my current role with Mars Incorporated, where I'm part of our global team that's responsible for building a sustainable business, where I'm responsible for our work on human rights, women's empowerment, and farmer incomes. And for Mars, as we look at the scale of this challenge, and as we reflect on the fact that poverty is a reality in many of the supply chains that we depend on for the success of our business, our view is, and the view of many other leading businesses in this area, is that poverty is not only morally unacceptable in global supply chains, it's also inefficient and unsustainable. Farmers who aren't able to make a decent living are not likely to be farmers for long, and their children certainly won't want to be farmers either. So the situation has practical business implications. It puts at risk our ability to grow and thrive in the future, and it certainly limits the potential of these hardworking families as well. So we come at this from a business interests perspective as well as from a principles perspective. And in fact, we as Mars have been trying for a long time to make a difference on this issue, to get after it and drive real progress for the farmers that our success is dependent upon. And we've frankly been very unsatisfied with the progress we've been able to make. It's incredible that decades into this journey of fighting poverty, there still isn't clear, available information about the high ROI, high impact programs that companies like Mars can adopt to make a difference on issues like this. And that's why last year we founded the Farmer Income Lab. We founded the lab because we wanted to crack the code on what it is that global companies like ours at the far ends of global supply chains that depend on smallholder agriculture could do to drive improvements in income. And in the first year of the lab, we decided to take a look back before we charted the future of this endeavor. And we looked back at the available evidence over the past 10, 20 years, the academic and other literature. What does it say about what does work? And we took away 3 key insights. The first was that it is possible to increase farmer incomes when a package of interventions is delivered to farmers that address a range of barriers that they're facing, just like in Project Nurture. But even those most successful bundled interventions only raise incomes to a degree, and very rarely enough for farmers to be lifted out of poverty. The second insight we saw as we looked back at the available evidence was that many of the most commonly used interventions by global companies like ours at the end of supply chains actually don't work. And this resonated because it's consistent with our experience in some of our supply chains. For example, in West Africa, in our cocoa supply chain, we've been working for many years on cocoa plant science, and we have varieties available for farmers that can double or triple their yields and double or triple their incomes. But we haven't been successful at scale in setting the incentives right for farmers to adopt these methods. So it really resonated with our own experience. Some of the most commonly used methods like productivity increase initiatives, when implemented alone, they don't have a track record of success. And the third insight we took away was that the enabling environment is so critically important. When the right public policies and social supports are not in place, progress is very difficult to achieve, and the role of governments is absolutely critical in establishing the right structures around supply chains that make success possible. Now, as we look ahead to the agenda of the lab going forward, we're excited about the think and do elements of the lab. We call it a think and do tank. The think aspect of the strategy going forward, based on these insights that we drew over the past year, is all about asking the tough questions that we don't think have been asked and answered before, that we hope by asking we will drive new breakthrough thinking and opportunities to take this work in new and more impactful directions. We want to ask the kind of questions that actually make people quite uncomfortable. They're kind of the elephant in the room questions that aren't typically openly discussed in forums about smallholder poverty and the role of private sector. Here are a few examples. Can companies continue buying raw materials like these at an arm's length without knowing where farmers are, what their lives are like, or the conditions on those farms? Or is that era over? And is a new model really necessary? And what does that model look like? How about the role of price? Shouldn't companies just pay more to farmers for these materials that they work so hard to produce? Is that a silver bullet to this problem? And for the models that have been tried around paying premiums to farmers, what has worked about them and what hasn't worked about them, and what can we take away from those lessons. What about farm size? Most smallholder farmers who are living in poverty are farming on less than 2 hectares of land. Is it really possible to generate a sustainable livelihood for a family on such a small plot of land? And if it isn't possible, who's responsible for the future livelihood of that family, and what is the role of business in that transition? And lastly, we need to ask the question around the role of governments and what they can be doing better from a structural perspective, from a public policy perspective, from a social support perspective to help farmers. So those are the kind of questions we want to ask. We hope it generates some heated dialogues and some fresh, new insights, because we do need to bring new thinking to this age-old problem. And we also then need to work on the do aspect of the Think and Do Lab. And in fact, Mars and a number of other companies are already getting started with the do side of the equation. As Mars, we're investing more than $1 billion over the next few years in building a sustainable business. And in fact, what we're doing is really rethinking the supply chains that we're a part of with the interests of farmers right at the heart. And as we do this in our cocoa supply chain in West Africa, our mint supply chain in India, and our vanilla supply chain in Madagascar, for example, we're doing this with partners because there's absolutely no way to accomplish these kinds of goals alone. Partners like the Livelihoods Fund for Family Farmers, which we founded with Danone recently. And that's where you all come in. I want to invite you to be a part of this journey. We cannot accomplish real breakthrough, meaningful progress on helping those 100 million smallholder farmers who are linked with global supply chains without you. There's real power at the intersection of business interests and the interests of these farmers, but we need your help to unlock that. We need bankers here who are willing to bring new financial instruments to farmers. We need the tech companies here who are willing to come up with new technologies to link farmers to markets. We need the nonprofits here who understand the culture and behaviors in farm communities and what incentivizes them to make decisions. And we need innovative and risk-taking thinkers in government to help us think in new and different ways about how to drive real progress to this goal. You know, if you've ever had an M&M or had a bowl of Uncle Ben's rice or chewed a stick of Wrigley gum, I think this is your opportunity to connect with the farmer who helped to make those materials possible. So I invite you to join us on this journey. And as I look back to Vietnam so many years ago, I remember that feeling of optimism and encouragement as I set foot and tried to make a difference in that community. And in fact, as I think about the lab, I feel even more optimistic today. Because even though we don't yet have the solutions at hand to this problem, what we do have is the right intent, the right investment, the right coalitions of the willing building around driving a solution to this problem. And I think that together we can make a real contribution through this work to SDG 1, no poverty. So please join us in this journey. Thank you.